Welcome back, everybody, to the Enemy's Perspective, a UteNation podcast. Today, we're discussing the Utah road game at West Virginia. Joining us is Keenan Cummings, editor of WVSports.com and a Heisman Trophy voter. I'm your host, Matt Stanley. Keenan, welcome to UteNation. Thanks for taking some time today.
Hey, appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, pleasure is all ours. So, West Virginia started out 2-2 with a pretty big win over Pitt, but a struggle last week against Kansas. How are things feeling in Morgantown this week?
Right now, I don't want to say gloomy, but given the state of the roster, all the uncertainty, and really just the injury bug has really hit West Virginia. They lost to Ohio on the road 17-10, and they lost two of their best players to injury for the season. Jaheim White was their featured offensive player, their running back, and then they lost Jaden Bray, their wide receiver. And that's continued, coming into this week. Their running back that rushed for 140 yards and 3 touchdowns filling in for Jaheim White, Ty Edwards, didn't even play against Kansas. So they had to kind of go down the depth chart even further. He is questionable this week against Utah. He's got a hip pointer. Their quarterback, who started all 4 games. Now, Rich has played multiple quarterbacks every game, but the guy that started the game, the guy that led that 10-point fourth quarter comeback against Pitt, Nico Markiel, was in Colorado looking at his foot. He had mid-foot pain, and probably never a good thing, when it's a Tuesday of a game week and you're in a different state getting your foot looked at. So that's going on. West Virginia has 2 offensive linemen that are questionable / probable. Their starting center is questionable. He got hurt against Kansas, had to leave the game, Landon Livingston, and there's some other guys with bumps and bruises on the roster. So this was already a team that returned almost no experience, at least in terms of at West Virginia.
Yeah.
They brought in 80 new players. 80. That's insane.
80?
That's Colorado numbers from a few years ago. So a lot of question marks, but this team has played better at home, and Rich has been able to get them to play pretty well at home. So it'll be interesting, but there's definitely question marks with this West Virginia football team right now.
Yeah, Utah fans will completely understand the injury bug. Utah's been there the last few years. It seems like every time you get something going, somebody's getting hurt. But you talked about you have 80 new people. That's a lot. So how do you think they've gelled together as a team and been able to keep any kind of culture amongst players with all those transfers coming in?
Yeah, I think that's the big thing. Rodriguez has talked about since he got here that, you got all these new players. The first year is going to be difficult. And I think everyone understands that. In terms of just establishing a culture, getting guys to play the way that he wants them to play, that hard edge, that's the buzz term around Morgantown, and kind of one of Rodriguez's catchphrases is hard edge. And he wants guys to play tough, hard, physical. And I think you've seen that, but still, when you look at just you're replacing offensive line. West Virginia lost their top 8 offensive linemen from last year, either due to graduation or transfers. And when you're bringing in, it's hard to rebuild a line anyways. It's really hard to rebuild an offensive line when you're trying to rely on the transfer portal and some young guys. So that's the area where West Virginia is still kind of gelling, trying to come together. I think defensively, this group's played really well for the most part. You look at that Kansas game, they gave up 41 points. 7 was off a kick return. And then the offense couldn't do anything. The defense they battled, they had chances, and really after a while you kind of get wore down. So I think offensively has been the biggest struggle for this team, and they're still trying to find answers. But defensively, this team's played pretty solid through 4 weeks.
What do you think's your defense's strong suit right now? Are they going to be better at protecting against the run or against the pass? Because looking at their stats, they held Pitt, I think, to 50 rushing yards all game. But then against Kansas, they ran 240 rushing yards against you.
Yeah, some of that was plays, just Jalen Daniels doing Jalen Daniels things.
Just Jalen Daniels things.
Yeah, kind of just, getting out, would get a crease and pick up 20, 25 yards. They busted a big run late in the game too. Once the game was already kind of blew open, I think it was a 60-some yarder. But, West Virginia missed some things in that game, up front, which they have not. They've been able to clean that stuff up. But I think some of that is what Kansas does to you. All the motioning, all the shifts, all the eye candy that they present makes things difficult. Defensive coordinator Zach Alley, on their first drive, Kansas, West Virginia had them in a 4th and 4, I believe, near midfield. And they actually ran the same call against the same call that Kansas had, and they still busted it. So it's something they had prepared for in practice, but really sometimes in games things move fast. They had some uncharacteristic busts, but so far it's been a pretty solid group, and I think they've done a pretty good job stopping the run for the most part. But mobile quarterbacks have hurt them a little bit.
Okay, so mobile quarterbacks causing an issue. Devin Dampier, definitely a mobile quarterback. As we already talked about, he's dealing with some injuries right now. There's some questions there. But so far, Utah is number 2 in the conference in rushing yards per game. But Texas Tech managed to keep Utah at right about 100 rushing yards. How do you think West Virginia is going to handle Utah's rushing attack this week?
I think when Utah runs the ball, West Virginia is going to be all right. I think what hurts West Virginia now I say that from a perspective that I understand Utah has a very good offensive line, but I think West Virginia's strengths up front, their defensive line is very good. Their linebackers have played well. Safeties have come up and run support when need to. I think where West Virginia is going to get in trouble is those off schedule plays. That's kind of what Jalen Daniels really hurt him with last week. Those plays where, it's 3rd and 7 and, the pocket breaks down and you lose contain and you're able to pick up some big chunks of yards. So of the design things, I think West Virginia's done a pretty good job about. It's some of those plays Ohio hurt them with this too. They were able to, their quarterback, Parker Navarro, who really is one of the more underrated quarterbacks in the country, in my opinion, really, really good player. Hurt him with his feet too in those type of situations. So you're playing a guy like Devin Dampier, who's very, very good and very, very hard to tackle too. So I think that West Virginia is going to have to do a better job there and kind of keep him in the pocket. They did a great job against Eli Holstein. They were able to mix things up, bring pressure, really frustrate him with what they did. They weren't allowed, they didn't allow him to squeeze out and get yards like he did against them the year before. So if they're able to keep him in the pocket and at least do a serviceable job up front when it comes to winning some of those battles, they're not going to win them all, obviously, but play physical up front. I think they have a chance to at least kind of, temper the run game a little bit.
So how about let's talk about West Virginia's run game. Marchio is questionable for the game, but Henderson, who would, correct me if I'm wrong, would be the most likely backup. He's currently your 3rd leading rusher on the team. Do you expect a lot of quarterback rushing coming out of West Virginia this week?
I think it depends on what quarterback you get. If Marchio plays, I think you kind of see him play like they played when he's been in the game. He's going to run. He's a willing runner, but he's not a guy like Jalen Henderson or Scotty Fox or Khalil Wilkins. Those guys are more design type quarterback runs. Jalen Henderson really gave the offense a spark last week. They were kind of dead in the water for lack of a better term for a lot of that game. And then Jalen Henderson came in. Now, granted, the game was kind of lopsided at that point, but he was able to get some things started with his legs. I think that's going to be a big part of the offense. Rich always talks about playing with 11, and I think that's what you're going to see if Marchio isn't ready to go.
Okay. I want to circle back to all the transfers that have come in. Of those transfers, who's been like the biggest standout from your transfers? And then who was somebody that you maybe expected a lot of, but you're still waiting to see what you were looking for out of that?
I think in terms of guy that's really stood out to me, now some of these guys are kind of working their way in. There was a court case, and one of their biggest impact transfers, at least on paper, was Jamori Robinson. He didn't even play until this past game against Kansas, kind of going through eligibility, a legal issue in court. So to be judged there, not ready to make any kind of determination. He's only played 25 snaps. But the guy that really has stood out to me has been Michael Coates, their cornerback from Nevada. He was an All-Mountain West selection last year, a guy West Virginia really prioritized. I think teams have only targeted him 5 times this year, and he has 3 pass breakups, I believe. He's allowed, I think it's 2 catches for 12 yards. So he's done a really good job in man coverage and kind of keeping West Virginia, at least that side of the field that he's on, really not being a factor, through the first 4 games. And that hasn't always been the case with some teams getting some shots on West Virginia. So he's played really well. In terms of guys, I guess it's hard to expect the offensive line when you're rebuilding it, because it's such a position where it's got to gel together and it's got to look good over time. That's why most offensive linemen take multiple years. But as a whole, I thought they made some real progress at first, especially from the first 2 games to Pitt, and then last week was a struggle. So I think if collectively that group, some of the guys they brought in, you got to see them play a little bit better if this offense is going to have success.
Okay, so speaking of offensive success, if you are West Virginia's coaching staff right now, you're making the game plan to go against Utah's defense. What do you think is the best plan of attack?
Well, I think you got to open it up a little bit. You got to get some of those quick throws, at least some easy access throws, some ways to kind of loosen up the defense, because obviously Utah is going to try to stop the run game. That's what West Virginia kind of bases their offense on. And when they can't run the football, they struggle. And they've struggled to run the football since Jaheim White got injured outside. You mentioned Edwards earlier. He's only the third leading rusher because the only time he's carried the ball was against Pitt, and he rushed for 140 yards. So without him, without White, they've struggled to really find any consistency. So I think you got to try to make things easy. Use some of the quarterback run game, and you got to get ahead of the sticks. That's been something that's really plagued this offense. When they struggle on first down, especially running the football, you either lose yards or in no net gain. You're behind the sticks and you're already struggling in the passing game. Those are not recipes for success. So West Virginia's got to be able to kind of control the ball a little bit, run the football, and then hit those big pass plays when they're there. Because once you do have some success running the ball, safeties are going to cheat up. You're going to have opportunities down the field.
So there's some question marks with the running backs for West Virginia right now. But let's talk about the receivers. Who are the guys at the receiver room?
Well, they lost Bray, as I mentioned earlier, and that's a big loss for them. But Cam Vaughn is a player. He's a guy that was with Rich Rodriguez at Jacksonville State. He was their leading receiver last year. Highly athletic guy, guy you can put outside, can make catches. Now against Kansas, they kind of try to take him away. Playing the safety over top, really wouldn't let West Virginia do things, and that's going to take. You're going to have some other guys step up. Rodney Gallagher's a slot guy. Played pretty well. Justin Smith-Brown's a fast guy on the outside that they've gotten the ball to a few times. Preston Fox was injured against Kansas, but he's another dependable guy. And they use their tight end too, Grayson Barnes. He's really a weapon in the passing game. He had 2 huge catches on that drive to tie the game against Pitt. One was a 34-yard catch down the seam, and then he caught a 2-yard touchdown. So they need more out of their receivers. Last week, they're not going to win very many football games when they can't throw the football like they did last week. It was a situation where they really struggled. I think the offense went 4 3-and-outs on their first 5 drives, and that's just hard to win a football game, especially on the road.
Yeah, almost impossible if you can't convert those third downs. But do you think your receivers are going to be more of a deep threat or more of a shorter pass threat for Utah this week?
I think it really depends on what Utah does too. But I think that what my personal opinion is, I think that West Virginia needs to kind of open it up a little bit and get some of those quick throws and then try to work it down the field. But they will take shots. Cam Vaughn's a guy that they've used down the field. They've tried a few to the slots down the field. So they have some guys. A guy like Jeff Weimer is a dependable possession receiver. So they have guys, even with Bray out. It's just a matter of kind of getting them the football, and that's been a problem at times, even with Mark Gill in there.
Okay, so we talked about your offensive game plan. Now go to your defense. How do you think they're going to come at Utah this week?
Well, I think you got to stop the run first and foremost. You got to be able to stop, and that includes what Devin Dampier is able to do if he's ready to go and he's himself. So I think you got to do that, and then you got to kind of not allow anything cheap. Same thing on offense for West Virginia. I think it's big. You can't miss assignments up front. You can't do the same thing on defense. You can't allow easy plays to happen. West Virginia's, they're at home, and I think they're 10-point dogs right now. So when you're, Rich Rodriguez kind of said it best. He was speaking specifically about offense, but it applies to the defensive side as well. When you're kind of building things up, getting a program started, when the plays are there, you have to make them. And for the most part, West Virginia's been able to do that defensively. But they've had times where, they've allowed some cheap things to happen. They've missed tackles, and things like that. You're not going to beat a team like Utah, especially under Kyle Whittingham, that's been as disciplined and just kind of as sound as they've been over the years. West Virginia saw it firsthand in the bowl game, 10 years ago now almost, but you saw it firsthand. Granted, now West Virginia's starting quarterback was out, but still, they just line up. They play their game, and you got to try to match that. And I think as long as West Virginia is sound defensively, I don't have any reason to believe that they won't be able to hang on that side of the ball. But there is that concern, like you saw against Kansas, that if the offense can't do anything, how long can the defense hold up if West Virginia is on the field so much?
Well, you talked about missed tackles, and going back to last week, Utah versus Texas Tech, that was a big issue for Utah, actually, was those missed tackles. So Utah's going to need to step that up and be making those tackles and taking those right angles. And just like you talked about West Virginia with Kansas, it wasn't a lot of small chunk plays, but the big plays where things just get away from you and you're missing a bunch of tackles and all of that stuff. So now, if you were Utah's defense, what are you expecting out of West Virginia's offense? How are you going to game plan for that?
It's hard because now the offense is similar, obviously, with every quarterback, but they do some different things. One thing I do, I guess, admire and think is kind of interesting about Rich is he tailors his offense around his quarterback. A lot of coaches say that. He really does it. He runs different things with different guys are in there, and it looks different. If you go back and watch that Pitt game, when Scotty Fox and Jalen Henderson were in the game, it looked a lot different than when Nico Markle was in the game at the end of the game. So I think that it depends on what quarterback, but it starts with the run. You got to be able to stop West Virginia's run game, get them behind the sticks. If they're able to do that, West Virginia's going to struggle. It's just the way it's been so far. And until that changes, I'm very much a see it to believe it type of guy. I've always been. Until that changes, until West Virginia shows the ability to move the football when they can't run the ball, I'm going to have a hard time believing it.
Okay, so Texas Tech came at Utah with a lot of cover zero. Dare you to throw that pass. Do you think West Virginia could copy that same style of game plan, stack the box, cover zero, and keep Utah from making those downfield throws?
Well, I mentioned Coates earlier, so they feel good about him in man coverage. And the other side, Jason Chambers has played pretty well too. So it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't be the biggest shock, especially because Zach Alley is a really, really interesting defensive coordinator. He's a guy that West Virginia went out and paid big money to. We're able to take him away from Oklahoma. He was calling Oklahoma's defensive plays last year, had a history of, with Rich Rodriguez at multiple stops, and he was kind of Rich's big swing for the fences hire. And so far, I've been pretty impressed with everything I've seen. He says he's multiple. You hear that word, buzzword multiple all the time. He means it. He'll switch up his defense from week to week. Played an entirely different, he played two outside linebackers against Pitt to confuse their quarterback. So I'm sure he's got some tricks up his sleeve. And obviously he's watched the film of what Texas Tech's done as well. So yes, I think that you will see them try to stop the run. I think that Utah is kind of similar to West Virginia, at least from what I've watched, that they need to run the football to have success too. So I think that it's going to be a battle of the line of scrimmage. Football always is, but some games it seems like it matters more than others, and this is one to me that on paper it definitely does.
So it's a battle of the line of scrimmage, right? You've already talked about some concerns about your offensive line. How do you think they're going to stack up to Utah's defensive line, who has been very successful at pressuring quarterbacks this year? And how do you think your quarterbacks are going to respond to that pressure?
Yeah, that's going to be the challenge for West Virginia offensively. And not just when they throw the football, they've got to be able to run it. They cannot get behind the sticks. This is not an offense right now that's built to overcome second 14, second 16, second 12 even sometimes. So I think that's going to be a key battle for West Virginia offensively. The offensive line has got to play much more like the unit that played against Pitt. They had a very good, athletic, deep defensive line. They're always trying to get upfield and attack, and West Virginia did a great job against them. But then against a team like Ohio, West Virginia really struggled. They struggled last week against Kansas. Some of that was what they do. Some of that was I don't want to say missed assignments because I'm not grading it, but looking at the film, it didn't look very good at times. There were times where guys got through untouched, and that just can't happen regardless of whose fault it was. So I think that it's about finding kind of a balance there and gelling this unit together. And obviously that's a lot more tough if you're missing your starting center and potentially two other starters from a line that, is already dealing with so much change. Now you hope you can get at least two of those three back. That's the plan. Rich called the guard and the tackle probable. So I think that's a good thing, but I would be surprised if the starting center played just based off comments this week.
Okay, so we talked about your offensive line. You did talk a little bit about your defensive line that you think they're a strong suit for the team. Tell us more about them. Who are the guys that we need to worry about on the defensive line?
They're more of a collection, of guys. That's the most experienced, I would say, group that came back. You have Eddie Vestorinen that's been here 4 or 5 years. Hammond Russell has been here 4 or 5 years. Asani Redwood's been here a while. Corey McIntyre. They brought in a transfer, a 4-year guy, Eddie Kelly, who's played well up front. I mentioned Jamori Robinson earlier. Now, he plays more of an outside linebacker type deal, but still a pass rusher. Braden Siders, same thing, pass rusher type linebacker. So they've got guys there, and I think the units played pretty well for the most part. But it's more of a collective. They don't have necessarily one guy you look at and you say, okay, but that's a good thing because they have depth, and that's what West Virginia is trying to get to. Some depth across the board. And right now, when it comes to the defensive line, that's a unit that, on paper, to me at least, is a strength. So we'll see how it plays out over the course of the year. How those things tend to change, from the early season to the end. But right now, I think the group's played pretty solid.
So I think we've covered almost everything as far as players, teams, and position units. But for a lot of Utah fans, this is going to be the first time going to Morgantown, going to West Virginia. I've heard a lot of good things about West Virginia's home environment. What can Utah fans expect going down to Morgantown for the first time?
Oh, it's a great college environment. If you've never been to Morgantown, I definitely recommend you make the trip. Now, it's a long one. I understand that, but I definitely recommend it. It's a great college type environment, small town. It's said that, Morgantown is the biggest place in the state on game day. 60,000 some fans. It should be a really, really lively environment. And there's a lot of things to do as well if you're coming in for the weekend, which I imagine you're going to be if you're coming from Utah. There's a lot of kind of establishments, there's hiking, trails, fishing, all that kind of stuff, which I think people would have a good time with. But it's a really good environment. I think that fans are going to be impressed, with what they see. It's definitely, you think of West Virginia, a lot of people don't know much about it, but when you get out here, there's one thing that's very true about this place. People absolutely love this football team and this basketball team. It is the pro team in the state. Anywhere you go in West Virginia, you're going to see the Flying WV somewhere.
There are a lot of, I think, similarities between Utah and West Virginia's success at home with big crowds. So you talked a little bit about the the spread, with West Virginia being 10-point dogs at home. I was showing this morning, Utah favored minus 12.5. With that being said, do you have a score prediction or a spread prediction for us today?
Oh man, that is tough. I think that Utah is going to win this game. I do think it's going to be closer though than people expect. I think this is going to be a fourth quarter type game. West Virginia has played very well at home so far. They showed that against Pitt. I think they were almost 9-point underdogs against Pitt and rallied and played really well. I'm not sure the environment will be quite that. Obviously the backyard brawl is one of those big rivalry games and that a lot of people don't talk about in college football. They probably should, but the environment was incredible for that game. But this environment will be great. Utah's going to have to earn it, as long as West Virginia doesn't kind of trip over themselves. So I think it'll be close, but I think Utah is going to probably win this game 27-20, something like that.
Everybody's excited for this game. Utah really needs a comeback game, get right game after what happened last week at home against Texas Tech. But Keenan, thank you so much for coming today. It was a real pleasure to have you on.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for having me on anytime.
Thank you so much to everybody for listening today. Please like and subscribe and stay tuned for more UteNation podcasts and coverage.